This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to look at one of the game's evergreen keywords, meaning it appears in every set, and that is Indestructible. Indestructible is a powerful keyword that made its debut in 2004's Darksteel. An indestructible permanent is a real pain to deal with, as it can't be removed by destroy effects or lethal damage. They can still be taken down by exile effects, and indestructible creatures can be destroyed by effects that lower their toughness, but obviously there are a lot fewer answers for indestructible permanents than there are for most. This is actually the second time I've looked at Indestructible. I looked at it the first time way back in the 56th MTG Top 10, which came out in June of 2017. Also, apparently, there's a typo in that old Indestructible thumbnail that I haven't corrected in almost 6 years. But anyway, as you can imagine, this list has changed a lot over the last 6 years. There's only one card on the list that is in the same spot it was in back then, and there are 4 entirely new cards on it. To be eligible for this list, a card needed to have or grant Indestructible. There are 323 cards that were eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. We'll actually look at a bit more than that because, as usual on a list that updates an old one, I'll also talk about the cards that were on the list last time but didn't make it this time. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Worlds, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's look at the 4 cards that were on the list in 2017 but didn't make the list this time, starting with Erebos, God of the Dead, who was number 10 in 2017. It hasn't gained a single point since then, so it's no surprise that this indestructible god was unable to hold on to its spot. Like all Theros gods, he brings that indestructibility, but he also only becomes a creature when your devotion gets high enough. He also shuts down your opponent's ability to gain life, and lets you pay mana and life to draw cards. Erebos gained all of his points in Block and Standard. While there were lots of devotion decks in Theros Standard, Black was arguably the most powerful of the bunch thanks to cards like Erebos and Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which hugely incentivized you playing cards with lots of black mana symbols. Next, there's Valorous Stance, which was at number 7 back in 2017. This modal instant can destroy creatures with toughness 4 or greater, and it can also grant a creature indestructibility. That modality is nice because neither of these effects are always going to be useful, but they are both powerful when the situation calls for them. The stance has actually been fairly active since 2017, largely as a result of a reprint in Innistrad Crimson Vow, which made it legal in Standard again. However, it only has 66 points and it took 71 to make the list this time. Because it's still in Standard right now, there is a pretty good chance that it could eventually make its way back onto the list. Next, there's Elspeth Knight Errant, who was at number 6 last time. She was even closer to staying on the list than Valorous Stance, as she has 69 points, too short of the 71 points needed to be the number 10 card on the list. She makes the list as a result of her ultimate, which gives you an emblem that makes most of your permanents indestructible. She also comes with a +1 that makes a creature token, which does a pretty good job of protecting her, and another +1 that gives a creature +3/+3 in flying until end of turn. The fact that she has 2 abilities that are +1s also means that her loyalty never goes down unless your opponent damages her, so it makes getting to her powerful ultimate somewhat possible. She has seen play in aggressive white decks in several formats. In Extended, she was played in Doran and Zoo. In Modern, she's gained points in Hate Bear, Bant Aggro, and also Zoo. She's even played in Legacy aggro decks like Maverick, in addition to being played in Stoneblade. She's still gaining points in Legacy these days, and it's likely she'll continue to gain points, so, like Valorous Stance, she may find her way back onto the list. Lastly, there's Westvale Abbey, which was at number 5 on the 2017 list. This starts out as a land that can make creature tokens, and then if you pay 5 and sacrifice 5 creatures, it turns into the impressive Ormondal Profane Prince, an indestructible demon that also has flying, lifelink, and haste. Yeah, that will put the game out of reach for your opponent in a hurry. It gained most of its points in Standard, where it was played in sacrifice decks, but it was also a pretty easy inclusion in just about any creature-heavy deck, since it was a colorless land with upside. So it also showed up in decks like White Weenie. It's gained a few points in both Pioneer and Modern, but it has only gained 2 points total since 2017, so it has fallen very far behind the cards that remained on the list. Now that we've covered the 4 cards that are no longer on the list, let's get to the list proper. At number 10, it is Fleecemane Lion, which was at number 4 last time. The Lion is a 2-mana 3/3 that comes with Monstrosity, which in this case means you can pay 5 to give the Lion Indestructible and Hexproof, as well as a +1/+1 counter. Hexproof, of course, means your opponent can't target it, and Indestructible made it so that even board sweepers couldn't take it down. The particularly nasty thing to do with the Lion is leave up mana for Monstrosity if you can, since if your opponent decides they're going to try to kill it, you can use it in response and fizzle their removal spell. The Lion was a key part of many decks during its time in Block and Standard, because it's difficult to beat this kind of efficiency. Early in his time in Standard, he was featured in decks like Naya and Selesnya aggro. However, it put up the lion's share of its points in a deck that dominated Standard starting in 2014, Avacyn. Despite all of that Standard success, the Lion has not gained a single point, and not just since the 2017 list. Back then, it had already been 2 years since he gained his last point. Still, its colossal score in Standard was enough to allow it to stay on the list this time, but as we saw, there are 2 cards that are right behind it and still gaining points, so the Lion's days on this list are definitely numbered. At number 9, it is Hazoret the Fervent, which didn't make the list last time. While this Amonkhet god existed back in 2017, it was a brand new card that only had 4 points. Like all the Amonkhet gods, it is of course indestructible, but you have to meet a requirement for it to be able to attack or block. In this case, you have to have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. Hazoret helps you out there by letting you discard cards to damage your opponent. It's usually played in aggro decks too, which often have an empty hand by the time they play their 4-drop anyway. The whole package makes for a very aggressive creature that can smash in for hasty, difficult to block damage, and can finish the opponent off with its ability. Hazoret was a heavily played card in standard red-based aggro decks, and was one of the defining cards in the format while it was there. It's also seen play in other formats, though not at a super high rate. In Pioneer, it sees play in a variety of red aggro decks. In Modern, it has a few points spread across decks like Jund Affinity and Hollow One. It's also seen play in Legacy, appearing in Dragon Stompy decks, a mono-red prison deck that aims to lock the opponent out of the game with cards like Chalice of the Void and Ensnaring Bridge, and Hazoret provides the deck a win condition with its direct damage ability. Hazoret is likely to keep gaining points going forward. At number 8, it is Dark Depths, which was unranked last time. Dark Depths is a legendary snowland that enters with 10 ice counters. You can remove the ice counters by paying mana, and when the last ice counter gets removed, you get a 20/20 flying indestructible token. It's gained all of its points in decks that specialize in finding a way to remove those counters in the extreme early game. It had been around for about 11 years back in 2017, but it only had 18 points. For the first several years of its existence, it was considered an absolutely terrible card, but that all changed when cards were printed that could combine with it. First, there was Vampire Hexmage, which allowed you to remove all the tokens at once, giving you a 20/20 Merit Lage on turn 3. The combo was first utilized and extended in 2009, and was successful enough that Dark Depths was preemptively banned out of Modern, and it remains banned there today. Legacy is really where Dark Depths has gone on to shine, though. That's because, in addition to the Hexmage, you can also use Thespian Stage. Legacy Lands is one of the biggest decks in the format. It's a deck loaded up with a variety of utility lands and land tutors, and one of the main ways it can win is with the Thespian Stage Dark Depths combo. Dark Depths is one of the best ways to win in all of Legacy. It also sees some play in Vintage, where it isn't quite as big of a portion of the metagame. It is going to keep gaining points in the Eternal formats, and especially Legacy, and that bodes well for its future on the list. At number 7, it is Archangel Avacyn, who dropped from the number 2 spot. She is a 5-mana 4/4 with Flash, Flying, and Vigilance, and, importantly for this list, she makes all of your creatures indestructible until end of turn when she enters the battlefield. Avacyn's upside doesn't end there either. She can also transform into a larger creature who does 3 damage to the whole board. The design here is pretty cool because you don't have complete control over when she transforms, and your opponent could potentially take advantage of it, but it's still hard for you not to come out ahead since you have a huge flyer that will survive the effect no matter what, while also doing 3 damage to your opponent. She was basically a staple in white decks in Standard, regardless of whether the deck was a control or aggro deck. All of her abilities make it pretty easy to get 2 or even 3-for-1s out of her, and that really devastates your opponent. While almost all of Avacyn's points came in Standard, she also has a lone Modern point from 2018, and more recently she's been seeing some play in Pioneer. She has gained 5 points since 2017, but hasn't gained a point since 2020, so she may fall off of the list in the long run. At number 6, it is Boros Charm, which moved up 3 spots after gaining 56 points over the last several years. Like most charms, this one has 3 different options. One of them gives all of your permanents indestructible. You can also choose to do 4 damage to the opponent or give a creature double strike. This is mostly an aggressive card. The 4 damage and double strike modes are really all about doing as much damage as you can as quickly as possible, and the indestructibility mode saves your board from most board sweepers, which are often the Achilles heel of aggro decks. To be fair, the mode most frequently used on Boros Charm is 4 damage to the opponent, and as a result it has largely been played in Burn or Boros deck wins decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. But this is still a burn spell that has extra utility that you can cash in corner cases, and that's pretty sweet. It's going to keep gaining points. At number 5, it is Selfless Spirit, which moved up 3 spots after gaining 59 points over the last several years. This 2-mana 2/1 flyer has nice aggressive stats and the ability to sacrifice itself to give all of your creatures indestructible. Like with Boros Charm, giving your creatures indestructibility is a big deal because it means your aggro deck doesn't need to sweat board sweepers nearly as much as most aggro decks do. Just trading your spirit to keep your board together is an awful deal for your opponent. It was played in white aggro decks in Standard, and in Modern and Pioneer, it's largely seen play in Spirit tribal decks. It's likely to keep gaining points. At number 4, it is Nissa, who shakes the world. This is the only card to make the list that didn't even exist in 2017. This powerful planeswalker comes with a +1 that animates lands, and an ultimate that lets you search up every forest in your deck and put it into play, and you get an emblem that makes all of your lands indestructible. Obviously, those 2 things go great together because if you've made some of your lands into creatures, the fact they are indestructible matters a whole lot more. Importantly, Nissa also comes with a powerful ability that doubles the mana that your forests produce, and because she untaps lands and gives them vigilance, you can attack your opponent and still get extra mana. She has been a key card in Standard, Pioneer, and Historic ramp decks where she can power out huge Hydroid Crassuses and Flying Shark tokens. These days, she's also played in Pioneer Devotion to Green decks, and that seems to be a format where she's going to keep gaining points. At number 3, it is Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, which wasn't ranked last time. This massive, indestructible Eldrazi exiles 2 permanents when you cast it, and exiles the top 20 cards of the opposing library when it attacks. So, while it doesn't have evasion, it is going to end most games within 3 swings, even if it gets blocked. It had been around for about 2 years in 2017, but it just missed making the list with only 40 points. But now it's super high up on the list thanks to gaining over 100 points over the last several years. Obviously 10 mana is a lot, but Ulamog is well worth the investment. Plus, most decks find ways to play it way ahead of schedule. In Standard, it was cheated into play using Aetherworks Marvel, which, importantly, lets you cast the card, so you even got to exile 2 permanents. The Marvel eventually got banned because the combo was so powerful. Meanwhile, in Historic, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, there are decks that have looked to ramp this indestructible monster into play, and in all of those formats, this is accomplished with powerful lands. In Pioneer, this is often accomplished in green devotion decks that use Nykthos. In Modern, the Tron lands can get Ulamog into play early, and in Legacy, Cloud Post can do the job. Ulamog is simply one of the best things you can cast in multiple formats, and that's what's allowed it to continue to amass points. It isn't out of the question that it could one day be the number 1 card on this list. At number 2, it is Darksteel Citadel, which moved up 1 spot after gaining 75 points over the last several years. This is the oldest card to make the list, as it's from the very first set that featured indestructibility. It is also undoubtedly the simplest card on the list. It's an indestructible artifact land that can tap for 1 colorless mana. That's it. That's the whole card. While it might be fairly straightforward, that doesn't mean that it isn't inherently powerful. It, along with the other Mirrodin artifact lands, helped make affinity decks absolutely absurd in both block and standard. In that type of deck, artifact lands often felt like they could tap for 2 mana, and it also made it so every single card in your deck could be an artifact if you wanted it to be, and you did want them to be because the decks were built entirely around artifact synergy. Eventually, the Citadel and other artifact lands got banned out of both block and standard, and when Modern was created in 2011, the other 5 artifact lands were preemptively banned to keep those decks from dominating, but Darksteel Citadel was lucky enough to go untouched, leading to it doing a ton of work in Modern artifact decks, including that format's version of Affinity, and it's still gaining a ton of points in that format today. After a standard legal reprint in Magic 2015, it took another run through standard, this time in Ensoul artifact decks, which are certainly the decks that have taken the most advantage of the Citadel's indestructibility. Making the Citadel into an indestructible 5/5 for 2 mana is a great deal. After the creation of Pioneer in 2019, Ensoul artifact decks found new life, and decks that turn Darksteel Citadel into a creature have been a big part of the format since it started. It also sees play in Pioneer affinity decks. It's likely to keep on gaining points going forward, and it will be interesting to see if it can stay ahead of Ulamog, and whether or not it can pass the number 1 card on the list, which is Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, which is the only card on the list to stay in the same exact spot. It hasn't been quite as productive as many of the other cards on the list, only gaining 22 points over the last several years, and he needed every one of those to stay ahead of Darksteel Citadel. Gideon qualifies for the list because of his +1, which turns him into a 5/5 indestructible creature until end of turn. Gideon was utterly dominant during his time in Standard in a way that very few cards are, and a huge chunk of his score of 173 comes from 144 Standard points. Gideon's ability to churn out 2/2 creatures to protect him and pressure your opponent, plus the ability to rumble himself, is really impressive. He also is interesting in that he has an ultimate you can use the minute you play him, and sure, it isn't game-breaking like many ultimates are, but sometimes an anthem for your whole team is what you need. His highlights in Standard came in decks like Abzan, Selesnya tokens, and Mardu vehicles. He's picked up top 8s in Modern in decks like Abzan, Junk, and Hatebear. He also sees play in Legacy's Death and Taxes and Miracles. He even sees a little bit of play in Vintage Landstill decks, where if you can stick Gideon ahead of Standstill, he can just churn out allies, which will eventually make your opponent have to play a spell. He isn't rapidly gaining points these days, but he isn't completely idle either. That said, I don't think he's doing enough to hold off the Citadel or Ulamog in the long run. If I revisit this list in 5 years, it's almost guaranteed that Gideon will have fallen out of the number 1 slot. So those are the top 10 cards in Magic with indestructibility. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at keyword abilities, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.